We talked earlier about emotions and intellect, and I wanted to continue on that theme a little more in terms of some of the pitfalls that happen in a person's life that get them sort of not functioning or not functioning as well on, well, just everyday living. And the first thing I want to say is we can all put up a facade most of the time. We can all put up a facade at work. We can put up a facade at our social organizations like church or synagogue or any kind of fraternal order we may belong to, or any kind of social setting, a bridge club, etc. But when we get home, it's kind of hard to keep hiding because that's a different level of intimacy. So lots of people come into my office because they're married and they're emotionally trying to push their spouse away because it's a little too close or a little too scary. So, and the first thing is that when two people get married and they have a different expectation of what marital intimacy is going to be, there's going to be problems because one person wants to be close and to be involved and engaged and, you know, really intertwined with the person they love, and the other person may come from a family where all that stuff is considered kind of and they like to keep a nice safe distance. And there's really no right or wrong to this stuff per se, and there really is no right or wrong to this stuff, but it does become a problem if people have different expectations. Hello, we just had someone walk in, so and we're glad to have them, and we'll, after I've done with this tape, we'll connect a little bit, but we just started this one. There's no right or wrong to like how much is okay or not, but the problem is if one person has one set of expectations and the other person has another, there's going to be problems. Now, one of the things that I do is I talk about the family I came from because it's a family I know very well, and it doesn't embarrass anyone else. And my parents were very hardworking middle-class people. My father was in the finance business. My mother was a legal secretary and also owned a credit bureau. And their marriage lasted 53 years. And on, you know, look at it from the outside, everything looked just great. And, you know, they paid their bills on time and got a new car every 3 or 4 years. And the house was freshly painted. And we had nice furniture and friends and all that stuff. So I want to be very clear that when I talk about this stuff, this is not a judgment about, those dysfunctional people. You know, because we all have a little bit of dysfunction in us. And it's just part of being human. It's specifically a part of the American ethos because we're very competitive and everybody likes a winner, but then we have people who lose, and what do you do with them? Well, we just don't talk about them very much because after all, they can go away and lose somewhere else and we don't have to think about them. But secretly, we all have a fear of losing because winning is a very important thing in our culture, and it's important for all of us to win at least some of the time doing something so we can feel like we have value to someone. Well, one of the questions I get asked all the time is, what constitutes a dysfunctional family? Because we have all of these media families on TV, we have our own families, we have our friends and neighbors or our extended family, and well, what's dysfunction? Well, the neighbors are always yelling at each other a lot, and it seems to me that that's pretty dysfunctional. Or the loud neighbors may say, you know, those people next door, they never lose their temper, they never show their emotions. That doesn't seem very functional either. Well, the defining rule of a dysfunctional family is very simple, very important. In a dysfunctional family, the rule, and it's so strong, by the way, no one ever has to actually say it. Everyone just knows it. And the rule is, don't feel. Don't talk about it. no matter what. If I'm hurting, don't acknowledge that I'm hurting. And certainly don't tell anybody I'm hurting, no matter what. And that's a sure recipe, not only for a lot of misery, but also to end up in a therapist's office. Because it's impossible to live that way. We're social beings. We're supposed to have relationships with other people where we can be honest, where the mask can come down, where we feel safe enough to say, you know, somebody said something at work today that really hurt me, and it got me to thinking, maybe I really am this loser, and maybe I missed the boat, and you know, God, I didn't get into college placement math when I was in 5th grade, and it's just everything's been downhill ever since, and I've been acting like I'm a winner because that's what I had to do to survive, but you know, I never talk about it. And I'm having a little fun with this, folks, so appreciate the humor, but also feel the feeling underneath. This is what happens in families. And these days, we have all these distractions. We have television, and we have video games, and we've got texting, you know, and just getting people to sit down and eat a meal together is a big deal. Getting people to sit down and participate in the preparation of that meal as a whole family, I don't think that's happened since the Waltons. And then we wonder why we have some of the problems that we have in the culture. We don't listen to each other, and we don't talk to each other very much. And add all of the other things that go along with life on top of that, and a lot of people sort of step out onto the stage of life believing that their emotions are the enemy. I don't like to feel stuff. I don't like to talk about it because that stuff gets me in trouble. So I'm just going to pretend none of it's there and everything's just fine. And then, like I said, we end up having problems. We end up getting elevated blood pressure. We end up getting autoimmune disorders because our immune system is taking all the pressure for the emotions we're not dealing with. So what are some examples? Does anyone have a question of a situation that maybe you could bring up that would that could be a part of this discussion? I love a silent audience. Okay. I'll give you some for instances. Well, my family. Both of my parents had a lot of family secrets they did not like to talk about. My mother did not like to talk about her father. And every time I asked her about my grandfather, she would get very steely and change the subject. He died in the flu epidemic of 1919. That's all you need to know. God, Mom, sorry I asked. My father would talk about his mother and his the various men that passed through her life that he knew about. He knew he had a father that supposedly had died when he was 3 years old of pneumonia because they were coming home from the opera and there was a beggar who was shivering in the cold. So he took his coat and gave it to the beggar, but then he got a chill and got pneumonia and died. He was such a noble man. And I was so much in love with him. And that's why I just can't, blah, 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 etc. Then, of course, she left New York City and went to Tampa, Florida, where she met another man named Columbus Guerin from Hendersonville, North Carolina. They lived together for 9 months. She decided to take his last name, and my father decided at the age of 5 years old that Edward V. Guerin sounded more American than Louis Bremsack Jr., which was in fact his real name on his birth certificate. And on and on and on. Well, at least he would talk about this stuff, so I had a little clue of what was going on. But we never sat down to eat a meal together as a family, because if we did, we might start talking about grandmas and grandpas and life in between and all the feelings that went along with it. Well, my father's mother was a single mother, and my father basically had to raise her between the beatings she gave him. And of course, she got those beatings because she was an orphan, and that's what the nuns in the Roman Catholic orphanages where she was raised did to her. Now, this is an example of multi-generational pain and how stuff that happens to our grandparents affects us. And anyone who says, oh, that stuff's really in the past and that shouldn't make any difference now, doesn't know a whole lot about human nature, history, or anything else in terms of how humans relate and what's important to us. The author William Faulkner said it best, the past is never dead, it isn't even really past. And what we know in family systems therapy is that we live 3 generations of our family. So not only do I have the emotions that I learned as a child, but I have the emotions that my parents learned as children from their parents. All of that formed what's okay to talk about and what's not okay to talk about. So for example, it was not okay for my mother to talk about her father. There was a lot of embarrassment because it turns out the real story was her mother had 6 children by 6 different men and wasn't married to any of them. So she learned early on, if she mentioned her father, her mother would go ballistic because he was the guy who promised he would marry her and didn't. So who do you think she took that resentment out on? My mother. So my mother learned early as a little girl, don't talk about my father because it'll bring pain into my life. And she carried that all the way through till the day she died. So when I would ask her about her father, I would get he died in the flu epidemic, that's all you need to know. Because for her, that subject had a lot of pain. Now, all families have examples of this. We Americans are a group of people who came from somewhere else because somewhere else was not very welcoming. I have a very good friend who, well, I'll back up. The 20th century American philosopher Eric Hoffer said, who are the Americans? We're the scum of the earth. We're the people who were the losers there, and they kicked us out, and we landed here because nobody else wanted us. I have a very good friend who's Korean American, and she originally fled North Korea with her mother as a little girl, and then later came to the United States in the 60s. And years ago we were talking, and she said something that was brilliant. She said, anyone who had anything in the old country stayed. The only people who came to America were people who had nothing in the old country except a knife or a gun at their back. So the first thing is, if your parents immigrated here from another country, or your grandparents, they probably didn't talk about the old country very much because it was painful. So part of their emotional set was, we don't talk about the past, that's the past, we're looking forward. Whereas if your family's been here for many generations, like most of my extended family back east, oh, they talk about the time Grandpa and Grandma came over after their house burned down and lived with us for 6 months while they were rebuilding their house. And it was so great having them around. And they told me all kinds of stories about how, my ancestors came here 200 years ago, blah, 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 this kind of stuff. The past is something to celebrate. The past is something to enjoy and all the emotions that go with it. So one of the things I discovered is that people who are emotionally secure don't have a problem talking about their family's history or their past. People who aren't emotionally secure, often it's very difficult to talk about those things because there's a lot of pain and hardship wrapped up in it. And that's one of the things that is a part of being American. I'm going to take a pause here right now, and we'll be back in a moment.